What if you discovered that the most terrifying story in American history was never told? Imagine a woman who transformed decades of torture into a revenge so calculated and brutal that even today, more than 150 years later, no one dares speak her name in Baton Rouge. Prepare to meet Louise Harber, the slave who became her master's nightmare, proving there's a limit to human cruelty, and when that limit is crossed, what emerges can be more terrible than any monster. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because you'll be witnesses to a story that will forever change your perception of justice and revenge. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1859. 2 nights, 5 men. And a truth no one was prepared to face. The sun rose over Beauregard Plantation as it always did. Golden, warm, indifferent to the suffering it witnessed daily. Louise Harber walked through the corridors of the big house with measured steps, carrying a silver tray that reflected her impassive face. At 32 years old, she had learned the most valuable art for an enslaved woman: becoming invisible. "Louise," Master Beauregard's harsh voice echoed through the hallway. "Where the hell is my coffee?" "Coming, sir," she replied, keeping her eyes down. But behind those lowered eyelids, Louise memorized every detail. The way he held the whip, even inside the house. The whiskey stain on his white shirt, the sour smell of sweat and tobacco that always accompanied him. The loose floorboard near his desk that creaked when stepped on. The heavy brass letter opener he kept within arm's reach. Every detail catalogued, filed away in a mind that had been sharpened by decades of survival. 23 years, Louise thought as she entered the office. 23 years since they brought me to this house. Every day catalogued, every humiliation archived. Master Beauregard didn't even look up from his papers when she placed the cup on the mahogany desk. His fat fingers leafed through sale documents. More slaves arriving, more lives being traded like cattle. Louise knew this routine. She had witnessed hundreds of families being separated in that very office, children torn from mothers' arms, husbands sold away from wives, all while Beauregard counted his profits and planned his next acquisition. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, but Louise saw something else in that light: opportunity. She had been studying the patterns of this house for over 2 decades. She knew when each servant moved through the halls, when the overseers made their rounds, when the master was most vulnerable. "Damn it, this coffee's cold," Beauregard muttered, finally looking up with bloodshot eyes. "Can't you people do anything right?" "You people." The words hit Louise like physical blows, as they always did. But today, instead of the familiar ache of dehumanization, she felt something else stirring in her chest. Something cold and calculating that had been growing in the darkness of her mind for months. "I'll bring fresh coffee immediately, sir," she said, her voice perfectly submissive. But as she reached for the cup, her fingers brushed against the letter opener. Heavy brass, sharp enough to open envelopes. Sharp enough for other purposes. "Tell Overseer Johnson I want to see him," Beauregard said, returning to his papers. "And have Sarah prepare the back room. We have visitors coming tonight." Louise felt a familiar chill run down her spine. The back room. She knew exactly what that meant. Another night where white men would come to inspect the enslaved women, choosing their victims like picking fruit at market. Another night of screams muffled by thick walls and heavy curtains. Another night where human dignity was stripped away along with clothing. "Yes, sir," she whispered, but her mind was already working. "Johnson will be here. Beauregard, too. Probably 3 or 4 more men from town. All of them drunk, all of them careless." As she walked back toward the kitchen, Louise's bare feet made no sound on the polished wooden floors. She had learned to move like a ghost, to be present but unnoticed, to serve without being seen as human. But tonight, that invisibility would serve a different purpose. The kitchen was bustling with activity as the house slaves prepared for the evening's entertainment. Sarah, barely 18, was kneading bread with trembling hands. The girl had been inspected 3 times in the past month, and each time she returned to the quarters more broken than before. "Sarah," Louise said softly, approaching the younger woman, "Master wants the back room prepared." Sarah's face went pale, the color draining from her dark skin like water from a broken vessel. Again. "But it's only been 2 weeks since—" "I know." Louise placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, but her touch carried something different now. A promise, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "Don't worry about tonight." "What do you mean?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might summon the very horrors they were discussing. Louise looked toward the big house, where smoke was already rising from the chimney. Master Beauregard was probably already drinking, preparing for his evening entertainment. Overseer Johnson would arrive soon, along with the other men who saw enslaved women as nothing more than objects for their pleasure. "I mean," Louise said, her voice carrying a weight that made Sarah look at her with surprise, "that some things are about to change around here." The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Louise went through her usual routines, cleaning, serving, being invisible, but every movement was now calculated. She noted the positions of potential weapons throughout the house, the heavy candlesticks in the hallway, the fireplace poker in the parlor, the carving knives in the kitchen, each item assessed for weight, balance, effectiveness. As the sun began to set over the Mississippi River, casting long shadows across the plantation, Louise made her way to the tool shed. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful. She had spent years studying the routines of every man on this plantation. She knew when they drank, when they slept, when they were most vulnerable. The shed smelled of rust and old wood, of tools worn smooth by countless hands. Louise's fingers traced over the various implements, hoes, sickles, hammers. Tools meant for farming, but tonight they would serve a different purpose. She selected a particular blade that caught the dying light, testing its edge against her thumb, sharp enough. "They think they know me," she thought, wrapping the blade in a piece of cloth and tucking it into her apron. "They think 23 years of submission means I'm broken. They think I'm just another piece of property to be used and discarded. They're about to learn how wrong they are." From the big house came the sound of laughter, male voices already drunk, already planning their night's entertainment. Louise closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Every laugh was a memory. Every voice was a face she had memorized. Every cruel word was fuel for the fire that had been building inside her for decades. When she opened her eyes again, they held something that hadn't been there before. Something cold and final and absolutely certain. The transformation had begun. Night fell over Beauregard Plantation like a heavy curtain, and with it came the familiar sounds that made every enslaved woman's blood run cold. Horses' hooves on gravel, crunching through the oyster shells that lined the circular drive. Men's voices growing louder with each drink, their laughter carrying across the humid Louisiana air like the calls of predatory birds. The creak of the big house's front door opening and closing as more visitors arrived for their evening's entertainment. Louise stood in the shadows of the slave quarters, watching, counting, memorizing every face, every voice, every detail that might prove useful in the hours to come. The quarters were built in a long row behind the big house, close enough for the slaves to be summoned quickly, but far enough away that their suffering wouldn't disturb the master's sleep. Master Beauregard stumbled onto the front porch, already drunk despite the early hour. His laughter carried across the yard like the bray of a diseased animal, harsh and grating against the evening air. Behind him came Overseer Johnson, a thin, cruel man whose pale eyes had haunted Louise's nightmares for years. Johnson's face was scarred from a childhood bout with smallpox, giving him a perpetually angry expression that matched his temperament perfectly. "Where are those girls?" Beauregard's voice slurred across the night air, his words thick with whiskey and anticipation. "Johnson, go fetch them. Our guests are getting impatient, and I promised them quality merchandise tonight." 3 more men, Louise noted, watching shadows move behind the lit windows of the parlor. "That makes 5 total. Perfect." The additional guests were easily identifiable even from a distance. Thomas Whitmore, the banker who owned the plantation next door, his portly figure unmistakable even in silhouette. Dr. Marcus Webb, whose medical bag sat prominently on the porch railing, the same bag he used to treat slaves like livestock and examine women for their breeding potential. And James Crawford, the sheriff whose badge glinted in the lamplight, the same badge that was supposed to protect people but had never protected anyone who looked like Louise. Johnson cracked his whip in the air, the sound echoing like a gunshot across the plantation grounds. The leather sang through the humid air with practiced precision, a sound that had accompanied countless beatings over the years. "You heard him, Sarah, Louise. Get yourselves cleaned up and get to the house, now, and don't keep the gentleman waiting." Other women emerged from their quarters like ghosts, faces resigned to another night of horror. But Louise felt something different coursing through her veins. Not resignation, not fear. Something much more dangerous, a cold, calculating rage that had been refined by decades of careful observation and patient planning. "Louise," Sarah whispered, grabbing her arm with trembling fingers. "I can't do this again. I can't." The girl's voice broke, and Louise could see the fresh bruises on her neck, barely hidden by the collar of her dress. "You won't have to," Louise said, her voice carrying a certainty that made Sarah look at her with surprise. "Trust me." As they walked toward the big house, Louise's mind catalogued every detail of the plantation's layout. The back door that squeaked on its hinges. She had deliberately avoided oiling it, knowing the sound might prove useful someday. The loose floorboard in the hallway that announced footsteps to anyone listening. The way sound carried through the thin walls. How screams from the back room could be heard in the kitchen if one knew where to listen. Information she had gathered over decades of forced servitude, now transformed into weapons more deadly than any blade. The big house reeked of cigar smoke and whiskey, the smell hitting them like a physical wall as they entered through the servants' entrance. In the parlor, 5 white men sat in leather chairs that had been purchased with the profits from human misery, their faces flushed with alcohol and anticipation. The room was decorated with the finest furnishings money could buy. Persian rugs, crystal decanters, oil paintings of pastoral scenes that bore no resemblance to the reality of plantation life. Louise recognized them all, had served them all at various times over the years. Beauregard, of course, master of this particular hell. Johnson, with his dead eyes and scarred face. Thomas Whitmore, whose banking empire was built on loans secured by human collateral. Dr. Marcus Webb, who treated slaves like livestock and white women like porcelain dolls. And James Crawford, the sheriff who turned a blind eye to every atrocity committed within his jurisdiction. "Well, well," Beauregard leered as the women entered, his eyes already glassy with drink. "Gentlemen, as promised, take your pick of the finest stock in Louisiana." Louise kept her eyes down, playing the role she had perfected over decades. But inside, she was mapping the room with the precision of a military strategist. 5 men, 2 exits, the main door they had entered through, and French doors leading to the garden. Multiple weapons within reach, fireplace poker, heavy crystal decanter, brass candlesticks, letter opener on the writing desk. They think they're predators, she thought, watching Crawford's hands already reaching for Sarah with the casual entitlement of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. Tonight they learn what real predation looks like. "I'll take the young one," Crawford announced, his sheriff's badge glinting in the lamplight, the same badge that was supposed to protect people like Sarah, now worn by a man who was about to victimize her. "And I'll have Louise," Dr. Webb said, his medical bag sitting beside his chair like a promise of additional horrors. "I've been wanting to examine her for quite some time, see if she's still suitable for breeding." The other men laughed at his crude joke, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. Louise felt their eyes on her like insects crawling across her skin, but instead of the familiar helplessness, she felt something cold and sharp settling in her chest, a clarity she had never experienced before. "Sarah," Louise said quietly, her voice barely audible above the men's conversation, "go to the kitchen. Tell them you need to prepare refreshments for the gentlemen." But they said, "Do it." Louise's voice carried an authority that made Sarah obey without question, recognizing something in her tone that hadn't been there before. As Sarah disappeared toward the kitchen, Louise began moving through the room, refilling glasses, lighting cigars, playing the perfect servant. But with each movement, she was positioning herself, calculating distances, timing their reactions, noting how the alcohol was affecting their reflexes, their awareness, their ability to respond to unexpected threats. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Louise," Beauregard observed, his words slurring together as he reached for his glass. "Usually you put up more of a fight. Have we finally broken that spirit of yours?" "No fight left in me, Master," Louise replied, her voice perfectly submissive. "That's what you think." Dr. Webb stood up, swaying slightly as the whiskey affected his balance. "Well then, shall we retire to the back room? I have some new techniques I'd like to try, medical procedures that might prove educational." The other men laughed again, that same cruel sound that had echoed through Louise's nightmares for decades. But tonight, it would be the last time she ever heard it. The back room of Beauregard Plantation had been designed for one purpose: to muffle screams. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, thick carpets absorbed sound, and the walls were lined with fabric that deadened any noise from within. It was a chamber of horrors disguised as a gentleman's retreat, complete with leather furniture and oil paintings that depicted scenes of pastoral tranquility, a grotesque mockery of the violence that regularly occurred within its walls. Louise entered the room behind the five men, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug that had been purchased with profits from human suffering. She had been in this room countless times before, always as a victim, always powerless. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she was the one with a plan. "Now then," Dr. Webb said, setting down his medical bag with practiced precision and beginning to remove his coat. "Let's see what we're working with. I want to examine the merchandise before we proceed." Louise turned to face them, and for the first time in 23 years, she didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she looked directly at each man, memorizing their faces one final time. Beauregard, whose cruelty had shaped her childhood; Johnson, whose whip had scarred her back; Whitmore, who had financed the purchase of her body; Webb, who had examined her like livestock; Crawford, who had ignored every cry for help. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice no longer submissive but cold as winter steel, "you've made a terrible mistake." Before any of them could react, Louise's hand found the heavy brass candlestick she had positioned earlier. The first blow caught Dr. Webb across the temple with surgical precision, the sound of brass meeting bone echoing through the room like a church bell tolling midnight. He crumpled to the floor instantly, blood pooling beneath his head, his medical bag spilling its contents across the expensive carpet. The second blow shattered Whitmore's jaw before he could even scream, the banker's face caving inward with a wet, crunching sound. His cry of pain was muffled by the blood that filled his mouth, teeth scattered across the floor like broken pearls. "What the hell?" Sheriff Crawford started, reaching for his gun with the reflexes of a man who had never faced real danger. But Louise was already moving, her body flowing like water around his clumsy attempt at defense. She had spent decades studying these men, learning their weaknesses, their habits, their fears. Crawford was slow when drunk, always fumbling with his holster. Beauregard was a coward who relied on others to do his dirty work. Johnson was vicious but stupid, prone to blind rage that made him careless. The candlestick caught Crawford's wrist with a sickening crack, the sound of breaking bone clearly audible in the confined space. His scream pierced the night air as his pistol skittered across the floor, but the thick walls of the back room swallowed the sound just as they had swallowed so many others over the years. "You crazy bitch," Johnson snarled, lunging forward with his whip raised, spittle flying from his scarred lips. But Louise had anticipated this reaction, had planned for it. She dropped low, sweeping his legs with a move she had learned from watching the men train their hunting dogs. Johnson crashed into the heavy oak table with bone-jarring force, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping like a landed fish. The whip fell from his nerveless fingers, coiling on the floor like a dead snake. 3 down, Louise thought, her mind working with mechanical precision. 2 to go. Beauregard had pressed himself against the far wall, his face pale with terror and disbelief. His expensive clothes were stained with sweat and something else. The acrid smell of fear-induced incontinence filled the air. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice cracking like a child's. "You're just a slave." "You're nothing." Louise turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his bladder release completely. This wasn't the broken woman he had tormented for decades. This was something else entirely, something that had been forged in the fires of his own cruelty, tempered by years of systematic brutalization, and now emerged as his worst nightmare made flesh. "Nothing?" Louise's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of every beating, every violation, every humiliation she had endured. "Let me show you what nothing can do." She moved toward him with deliberate slowness, savoring the fear in his eyes. Behind her, Whitmore was still choking on his own blood, while Crawford cradled his broken wrist and whimpered like a child. Johnson was beginning to stir, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. "Please," Beauregard begged, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor like a broken doll. "I'll free you. I'll give you money. Anything you want." Louise knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell the soap she had been forced to use to clean herself for their pleasure. "What I want," she said softly, "is for you to understand what helplessness feels like." From Dr. Webb's medical bag, she retrieved a scalpel, its blade gleaming in the lamplight like a promise of pain. The instrument was sharp enough to perform surgery, precise enough for the most delicate procedures, or other uses entirely. "No, no, no," Beauregard sobbed, but Louise's hand was already moving with the steady precision of a surgeon. The first cut was surgical in its accuracy, severing the tendons in his right hand with clinical efficiency. Beauregard's scream was music to her ears, the same sound she had made countless times in this very room, but no one had cared then. "That's for every time you hit me," she said calmly, moving to his left hand with the same methodical precision. "This is for every time you watched and did nothing." Johnson had recovered enough to try crawling toward the door, leaving a trail of blood from where his head had struck the table. Louise caught him by the ankle and dragged him back, his fingernails scratching futilely at the carpet. "Where are you going?" she asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "The party's just getting started." From the kitchen came the sound of breaking glass. Sarah must have heard the screams and dropped something in her shock. Louise hoped the girl had the sense to run, to get as far away from the plantation as possible before dawn brought the inevitable search parties. "You can't do this," Crawford gasped, still clutching his broken wrist. "I'm the sheriff. There'll be consequences." Louise laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Consequences? Like the consequences for all the women you've watched being brutalized in this room, like the consequences for turning a blind eye to every atrocity committed on this plantation." She picked up his fallen pistol, checking the chambers with practiced efficiency. Fully loaded, 6 shots, more than enough for what she had planned. "Tell me, Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "What's the consequence for a slave killing her master?" Crawford's eyes widened as he understood the implications. "Death," he whispered. "Exactly." Louise smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. "So what's stopping me from killing all of you right now?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps. These men, who had wielded absolute power over human lives for decades, suddenly understood what it meant to be powerless. But Louise wasn't finished. Death would be too quick, too merciful. She wanted them to live with what she was about to do. She wanted them to carry the scars, the fear, the helplessness for whatever remained of their miserable lives. The oil lamps flickered in the back room, casting dancing shadows across the walls as Louise worked with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Each cut was deliberate, calculated to cause maximum pain while ensuring her victims remained conscious. She had learned anatomy from watching Dr. Webb treat injured slaves over the years, knowledge that now served a very different purpose than its original intent. "Please," Whitmore gurgled through his broken jaw, blood frothing at his lips like foam on a rabid dog. "Just kill me." Louise paused in her work, looking down at the banker who had financed the purchase of so many human lives, who had reduced people to numbers in his ledgers. "Kill you? That would be merciful. And when have any of you ever shown mercy?" She returned to Johnson, who lay spread eagle on the floor, his limbs positioned exactly as he had once forced her to lie during his inspections. The irony wasn't lost on her. The overseer who had controlled every aspect of her physical existence, now completely at her mercy. With Dr. Webb's scalpel, she began carving symbols into his chest. Not random violence, but deliberate marks that would tell a story to anyone who understood their meaning. Each cut was a word in a language these men would never comprehend, but the message would be clear enough to those who mattered. "What are you doing?" Crawford whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming, his broken wrist cradled against his chest. "Leaving a message," Louise replied without looking up from her work. "Every plantation owner from here to New Orleans needs to understand what happens when you push someone too far." The symbols she carved were African, marks her grandmother had taught her before the old woman died in the fields, symbols of justice and retribution that predated the white man's arrival in Louisiana. Her grandmother had been born free in Africa, had known a time when their people were not property but human beings with names, histories, and dignity. Each cut was a word in that ancient language: justice, retribution, freedom, dignity. Words that had been stolen from her people along with their bodies, now written in blood, and pain across the flesh of their oppressors. Johnson's screams had faded to whimpers, his voice hoarse from crying out. Louise had been careful to avoid major arteries, ensuring he would live to bear her message. The cuts were deep enough to scar permanently, but shallow enough to heal, eventually. He would carry these marks for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of this night. "Your turn," she said to Crawford, wiping the bloody scalpel on Johnson's shirt with clinical efficiency. The sheriff tried to crawl away, but his broken wrist made movement agonizing. Louise caught him easily, her strength surprising even herself. Years of hard labor had made her muscles like steel cables beneath her dark skin, and decades of carrying heavy loads had given her an endurance these soft, pampered men could never match. "I have a family," Crawford pleaded, his voice breaking like a child's. "Children." Louise's hand stilled for a moment, the scalpel poised above his forehead. "So did I once, before you and your kind decided I was property instead of human." She had been 7 when they separated her from her mother, sold to different plantations like livestock at market. The memory of her mother's screams still echoed in her nightmares. A woman torn from her child, never to see her again. But tonight those screams were being answered, that injustice finally addressed. The scalpel found Crawford's forehead, carving the first symbol with surgical precision. He fainted from the pain, his body going limp, but Louise simply waited for him to regain consciousness before continuing. She wanted them all awake for this. She wanted them to feel every second of what she had felt for 23 years. When Crawford's eyes fluttered open, she continued her work. Each symbol was carefully placed, each cut precisely measured. By the time she finished, his forehead bore the African word for oppressor, a mark that would brand him for life. Beauregard had soiled himself completely, reduced to a sobbing wreck in the corner. His hands, now useless thanks to her precise cuts, hung at his sides like broken wings. Louise saved him for last. The master deserved special attention. "Do you remember," she said conversationally as she worked on Crawford, "the night you brought your son here, little Charles, wasn't it? 16 years old, and you wanted to make him a man using my body." Beauregard's sobs grew louder, his entire body shaking with terror and shame. That was different. You're not like us." Louise's laugh was sharp as broken glass, cutting through the air like a blade. "No, I'm not like you. I'm better. I never chose to hurt innocent people for pleasure." She finished with Crawford and moved to Whitmore, who had mercifully passed out from blood loss. The banker's face was a ruin, but he would live. They would all live, carrying her message written in scars across their flesh for the rest of their days. From outside came the sound of horses approaching, their hooves thundering against the packed earth of the plantation road. Louise froze, listening intently. Multiple riders, moving fast. Someone had heard the screams despite the thick walls, or perhaps Sarah had run to the neighboring plantation for help. Time to finish this, Louise thought, moving quickly to Beauregard with renewed urgency. "No, please," he begged as she knelt beside him, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll change. I'll free all the slaves. You'll do nothing," Louise said, placing the scalpel against his throat with steady hands. "Because you'll be too busy explaining to everyone how a helpless slave woman did this to 5 armed men." She didn't cut his throat. That would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, she carved her final message across his forehead, the African symbol for justice. Let him wear it for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of this night and the reckoning that had been 23 years in the making. The horses were closer now, voices shouting in the distance. Louise stood, surveying her work with the satisfaction of an artist completing a masterpiece. 5 men lay broken and bleeding, marked with symbols that would scar their flesh and their minds forever. They would live, but they would never forget. More importantly, they would never be able to hide what had been done to them. She moved to the window, peering through the heavy curtains. Torches bobbed in the darkness as riders approached the big house. At least a dozen men, probably armed with rifles and pistols. The hunt was beginning, but Louise felt no fear, only a strange sense of completion. She had done what needed to be done. The message was sent. Now came the consequences, and she was ready for them. But first, she had one more task to complete. Moving quickly, she gathered Dr. Webb's medical supplies and Crawford's gun. The night was far from over, and there were other plantations nearby, other masters who needed to receive her message. As the riders reached the front of the house, Louise slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows like smoke. Behind her, the screams of the 5 men echoed through the night air, a symphony of justice 23 years in the making. Dawn broke over Baton Rouge like a wound in the sky, painting the Mississippi River the color of dried blood. News of the horror at Beauregard Plantation spread faster than wildfire, carried by trembling voices and wide, terrified eyes. By sunrise, every white man in the parish knew that something unthinkable had happened. A slave had struck back, and struck back hard. Louise moved through the cypress swamps like a ghost, her dark skin helping her blend with the shadows between the ancient trees. She had discarded her slave dress for clothes stolen from a laundry line, men's clothing that allowed her to move freely without the restrictions of corsets and petticoats. The rough fabric chafed against skin that had known only coarse slave cloth, but the freedom of movement was intoxicating. Behind her, she could hear the baying of bloodhounds and the shouts of the search party. They had found the 5 men at dawn, still alive, but forever changed. The sight had sent strong men running from the room, vomiting into the morning air. Some had wept openly at the carnage, unable to comprehend how their ordered world had been so violently disrupted. Let them come, Louise thought, checking the chambers of Crawford's pistol with practiced efficiency. I'm not the same woman who ran and hid for 23 years. She had spent the remaining hours of darkness visiting 2 more plantations, her work becoming more refined with each encounter. The Whitmore estate, where she had left the overseer with a message carved into his back, the African symbol for cruelty etched deep enough to ensure permanent scarring. The Morrison place, where she had found the master in his study and given him a very personal lesson in helplessness, marking his hands with symbols that would make it impossible for him to hide what had been done to him. 7 men now bore her marks. 7 men who would carry her message for the rest of their lives, living reminders of what happened when human beings were pushed beyond their breaking point. But Louise wasn't finished. Not yet. There were dozens more who needed to learn this lesson. The sound of horses splashing through swamp water grew closer. Louise climbed higher into the massive oak tree where she had taken refuge, her movements silent and sure. From her perch, she could see the search party, at least 20 men on horseback, led by Colonel Marcus Thibodeau, the most powerful plantation owner in the parish. Thibodeau was a man who commanded respect through fear. His plantation, one of the largest and most brutal in Louisiana. He sat his horse like a military commander, which he had been during the Mexican War, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Spread out!" Thibodeau's voice boomed across the water, echoing off the cypress trunks. "She can't have gone far. A slave woman, alone in the swamps. She'll be dead by nightfall if we don't find her first." Louise smiled grimly at his words. They still thought of her as a helpless slave woman, despite the evidence of what she was capable of. Their arrogance would be their downfall, just as it had been for Beauregard and the others. One of the riders broke away from the group, following a false trail Louise had deliberately left. She had learned tracking from watching the overseers hunt runaway slaves, and now she used that knowledge to lead her pursuers astray. The rider was young, probably the son of a plantation owner, out for what he thought would be an easy hunt. Louise waited until he was directly beneath her tree, then dropped silently onto his horse behind him. The animal barely shifted under her weight. She had learned to move without disturbing even the most skittish horses during her years of stable work. The man's scream was cut short as Louise's arm encircled his throat, applying pressure to the carotid artery with surgical precision. She had learned this technique from watching Johnson subdue rebellious slaves, but she applied it with far more skill than the brutal overseer had ever possessed. The rider went limp in seconds, unconscious but alive. Louise guided his horse deeper into the swamp, away from the search party. When she was satisfied they were alone, she dismounted and dragged the man to a small island of solid ground. He was young, maybe 25, with the soft hands of someone who had never done real work. Probably the son of a plantation owner, raised on the profits of human misery. When he regained consciousness, he found himself tied to a cypress tree with his own rope, Louise sitting calmly in front of him on a fallen log. The swamp around them was alive with the sounds of insects and birds, but to the young man, it might as well have been the depths of hell. "Who are you?" he gasped, struggling against his bonds with growing panic. "I'm the monster you're hunting," Louise replied matter-of-factly, her voice calm as still water. "Though I prefer to think of myself as a teacher. You're insane. When they find you, they won't." Louise's voice carried absolute certainty. the confidence of someone who had survived in hostile territory for decades. "I've been invisible for 23 years. I know these swamps better than any of you. I know where to hide, where to strike, where to disappear." She leaned forward, studying his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "What's your name?" "I don't have to tell you anything," he said, trying to project defiance despite the tremor in his voice. Louise sighed and pulled out the scalpel, its blade catching the filtered sunlight that penetrated the swamp canopy. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. I've had a very long night, and my patience is wearing thin." "Robert," he said quickly, his bravado crumbling at the sight of the blood-stained blade. "Robert Thibodeau, the Colonel's son." Louise nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect. You're going to carry a message to your father." "What message?" Louise began carving, her movements precise and practiced. Robert's screams echoed across the swamp, but the sound was swallowed by the vast wilderness. When she finished, she had carved a single word across his forehead in the ancient script her grandmother had taught her: justice. "Tell your father," Louise said as she untied him, "that this is just the beginning. Tell him that every plantation owner in Louisiana has a choice to make: free their slaves or face the consequences." Robert stumbled away, clutching his bleeding forehead, his horse long since fled in terror. Louise watched him go, knowing he would deliver her message. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the sight of the Colonel's son bearing her mark would send shockwaves through the plantation elite. As the sun climbed higher, Louise made her way deeper into the swamp. She had prepared for this moment for years, secretly caching supplies in hidden locations throughout the wetlands: food, weapons, medicine, everything she needed to wage her private war against the system that had enslaved her people. The search party's voices grew fainter as she moved away from them, their shouts and curses fading into the background noise of the swamp. They were looking for a frightened runaway slave, not a calculating predator who had turned their own tactics against them. 2 nights, Louise thought, settling into a hidden camp she had prepared months ago. 7 men marked, but there are dozens more who need to learn this lesson. The Rousseau plantation sat like a white jewel against the dark Louisiana landscape, its columns gleaming in the moonlight like the bones of some ancient beast. Louise crouched in the sugarcane fields, watching the house through eyes that had learned to see in darkness. She had been observing for 3 hours, cataloging every movement, every pattern, every weakness in their defenses. Master Henri Rousseau was hosting a dinner party. She could see the shadows of guests moving behind the lit windows, hear the clink of crystal and the rumble of masculine laughter. The same laughter that had echoed through her nightmares for decades, the sound of men who believed themselves untouchable, above consequence, beyond the reach of justice. Perfect, Louise thought, adjusting her grip on Crawford's pistol. More witnesses to carry the message. She had spent the day moving through the swamps, evading the search parties that combed the wetlands with increasing desperation. The news of Robert Thibodeau's encounter had spread like wildfire, and fear was beginning to take hold among the plantation elite. Some had already begun hiring additional guards, posting sentries, turning their homes into fortresses. But fear wasn't enough. Louise wanted terror. She wanted them to understand the helplessness their victims had felt for generations, to experience the constant dread that came with knowing violence could strike at any moment. Moving like smoke through the cane fields, Louise approached the plantation house from the rear. The slave quarters were dark and silent. The inhabitants had learned long ago to make themselves invisible when their masters entertained guests. But Louise could sense their presence, could feel their eyes watching from behind shuttered windows as she passed. The kitchen door was unlocked, as she had expected. House slaves were required to move freely during dinner parties, serving the endless needs of their masters and their guests. Louise slipped inside, her stolen men's clothing allowing her to move without the rustle of skirts that might betray her presence. The kitchen was empty except for an elderly slave woman washing dishes, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same task thousands of times. Louise recognized her. Mama Celeste, who had worked in this house for 40 years, who had seen generations of slaves born, sold, and broken within these walls. The old woman looked up as Louise entered, her eyes widening in recognition. "Child," Celeste whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of running water. "What are you doing here? They got every white man in the parish looking for you." "I know," Louise replied softly, moving closer to the window that overlooked the dining room. "How many guests tonight?" Celeste glanced toward the dining room, where voices rose and fell in animated conversation punctuated by bursts of cruel laughter. "6 plus Master Henry. They've been drinking since sunset, talking about what they're gonna do when they catch you." Louise's smile was cold as winter steel, devoid of any warmth or humanity. "They're about to find out." She moved through the servants' passages that honeycombed the old house, routes she had learned during her years of forced visits to various plantations. These hidden corridors allowed slaves to move unseen, to appear and disappear like ghosts in service of their master's comfort. Tonight, they would serve a very different purpose. Through a crack in the wall, Louise observed the dining room. 7 men sat around a mahogany table laden with fine china and crystal, their faces flushed with wine and self-importance. She recognized them all: plantation owners, overseers, men who had participated in the systematic brutalization of her people for decades. "The bitch has to be caught," Master Henry was saying, his voice slurred with alcohol and thick with hatred. "What she did to Beauregard and the others, it's unnatural. Slaves don't act that way." "Maybe we've been too soft on them," suggested another man, Master Boudreau from the neighboring plantation, his jowls shaking as he spoke. "Maybe it's time to remind them of their place." Louise's hand tightened on the pistol grip. Their place. As if human beings could be assigned places like furniture in a room, as if the color of one's skin determined their worth as a person. "The problem," said a third voice, Overseer Landry, whose whip had scarred countless backs over the years, "is that we let them think too much. Education makes them dangerous." Education. Louise almost laughed at the irony. These men feared knowledge because they understood, on some primitive level, that their entire way of life was built on ignorance and brutality. They knew that if their slaves truly understood their situation, if they realized their own power, the whole system would collapse overnight. She waited until the servants had cleared the main course and retired to the kitchen, leaving the 7 men alone with their wine and their arrogance. Then she stepped out of the shadows and into the dining room, Crawford's pistol held steady in her hand. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said conversationally, her voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. The reaction was immediate and satisfying. Wine glasses shattered on the floor as hands jerked in shock. Master Henry's face went white as parchment, while Overseer Landry reached instinctively for a weapon that wasn't there. The carefully ordered world of the plantation elite had been invaded by their worst nightmare, a slave who refused to know her place. "The devil," someone whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "Not the devil," Louise corrected, moving around the table slowly, keeping the gun trained on the group. "Just a woman who's tired of being treated like an animal." She moved around the table slowly, her bare feet silent on the polished wooden floor. "Please don't let me interrupt your dinner conversation. You were discussing education, I believe. How knowledge makes slaves dangerous. You're making a mistake," Master Henry said, trying to project authority despite the tremor in his voice. "Kill us, and they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Kill you?" Louise's laugh was sharp as broken glass, echoing off the high ceilings. "Gentlemen, you misunderstand my purpose. I'm not here to kill you, I'm here to educate you." From her belt, she drew Dr. Webb's scalpel. The blade caught the candlelight, gleaming like a promise of pain to come. 3 months had passed since the first night at Beauregard Plantation, and Louisiana had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The name Louise Harber was whispered in parlors and shouted in newspapers across the South, spoken with a mixture of terror and grudging admiration that made the plantation elite uncomfortable. Some called her a demon, others a revolutionary. But everyone knew her message, and everyone understood that the old order was crumbling. Louise stood on the deck of a steamboat bound for New York, watching the Louisiana shoreline fade into morning mist. She wore the dress of a free woman now, simple but clean, purchased with money taken from her victims during her 3-month campaign of terror. Her hair was uncovered, flowing freely in the river breeze, her back straight with a dignity she had never been allowed to show during her years of bondage. Behind her, the state she was leaving bore the scars of her systematic campaign. 14 plantation owners had received her personal attention, each one marked with symbols that would remind them daily of their crimes. Dozens more had freed their slaves, rather than risk a midnight visit from the woman the newspapers called the Phantom of Baton Rouge. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. After the second night, the authorities had mobilized every resource to capture her. Hundreds of men with dogs and guns had combed the swamps, but Louise had always been one step ahead. She knew the land better than her hunters, understood the rhythms of the bayou, and she had allies they never suspected. The slave network had protected her, hidden her, fed her information about which masters were the cruelest, which overseers the most brutal. For the first time in their lives, enslaved people had seen one of their own strike back successfully, and the effect had been electric. Word spread through the quarters like wildfire. There was someone fighting back, someone who refused to accept the system that had ground them down for generations. Not all of them understood, Louise thought, remembering the fear in some slaves' eyes when they looked at her. They were so broken they couldn't imagine fighting back. But others had been inspired. Reports of slave rebellions had begun trickling in from across the South. Small acts of defiance at first, work slowdowns, accidents that destroyed equipment, mysterious fires in cotton fields. But the spirit of resistance was spreading, carried by whispered stories of the woman who had turned the tables on her oppressors. The steamboat's whistle blew, a mournful sound that echoed across the water like a funeral dirge for the Old South. Louise pulled her shawl closer against the morning chill and thought about the letter in her pocket. Correspondence from abolitionists in the North who had heard her story and wanted to meet her. She had become a symbol, they said. A living proof that the enslaved were not the helpless victims their masters claimed them to be. Her story was being told in secret meetings and underground newspapers, inspiring others to action. Frederick Douglass himself had written to her, expressing his admiration for her courage and inviting her to speak at abolitionist gatherings. But symbols come with a price, Louise reflected, touching the scars on her own hands. Marks left by 23 years of bondage that would never fully heal. The final confrontation had come 2 weeks ago, when Colonel Thibodeau had cornered her in an abandoned sugar mill outside Baton Rouge. He had brought 20 men, thinking numbers would be enough to capture one woman. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Louise had turned the mill into a trap, using her knowledge of the building's layout to pick off his men one by one. She had spent weeks preparing the site, placing weapons and creating escape routes, turning the abandoned structure into a fortress that favored the defender. When it was over, Thibodeau lay bleeding from a dozen precise cuts, his son Robert weeping beside him. "Why?" Thibodeau had gasped, his voice weak from blood loss. "We gave you food, shelter, purpose. Why throw it all away for this madness?" Louise had knelt beside him, her voice soft but implacable as steel. "You gave me nothing. You stole my life, my family, my humanity. I'm simply taking back what was always mine." She had left him alive, like all the others. Death would have been mercy, and mercy was something these men had never shown her people. Instead, she had carved the word oppressor across his forehead in the ancient script, ensuring he would carry her message for whatever remained of his life. Now, as the steamboat carried her toward freedom, Louise thought about the future. The abolitionists wanted her to speak at their meetings, to tell her story to audiences who had never seen the reality of slavery. They wanted to use her as a weapon against the institution that had created her, to show the world what happened when human beings were pushed beyond their limits. Let them, she decided, watching a flock of pelicans wheel over the muddy water. I've learned to be many things: invisible, patient, deadly. Now, I'll learn to be a voice. A young white woman approached her at the rail, her face earnest and sympathetic. She wore the simple dress of a Quaker, and her eyes held the fervor of someone committed to a righteous cause. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. Are you Louise Harber?" Louise studied the woman's face, seeing genuine curiosity rather than fear or condescension. "I am. I'm Sarah Mitchell from the Anti-Slavery Society in Boston. We've been following your campaign. What you did was extraordinary." "What I did was necessary," Louise corrected, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "And it's not finished." Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You mean to continue?" Louise looked back toward Louisiana, where smoke was still rising from plantations that had accidentally caught fire in the night. The system that had created her was wounded, but not dead, and she knew there would be others like her, others who would reach their breaking point and decide to break back. "The system that created me is still in place," she said, her voice carrying across the water like a promise. "As long as human beings are bought and sold like cattle, there will be others like me, others who reach their breaking point and decide to break back." She turned to face Sarah fully, and the young abolitionist saw something in her eyes that made her step back involuntarily. It was the look of someone who had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and emerged transformed, tempered by fire into something harder and more dangerous than her oppressors had ever imagined possible. "I'm going north to tell my story," Louise continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "to show people what slavery really creates. Not grateful servants or happy workers, but human beings pushed beyond their limits. And when those limits are reached..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The scars on 14 Louisiana plantation owners spoke eloquently enough, and the fear in the eyes of countless others told the rest of the story. As the steamboat rounded a bend in the river, Louise Harber disappeared from Louisiana forever, but her legacy remained, written in blood and fear across the landscape of the antebellum South. The slave who had become a nightmare was gone, but in her place stood a free woman with a story to tell and a revolution to inspire.